a soothing journey through time. Good evening, dear friends. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and let the world outside fade away, I invite you to journey with me back through the mists of time, not to a place of fear, but to a story of resilience, mystery, and the quiet power of nature that reminds us how small we truly are in this vast world. Close your eyes if you wish, breathe slowly, and allow yourself to drift into a tale of a time long ago, when Europe shivered under the grip of something few could understand, a phenomenon that would reshape kingdoms and remind people of their fragility. This is the story of the Great Famine, of the year that changed everything, of how one merciless winter and the years that followed taught medieval people lessons written in frost and hunger. Imagine, if you will, the world as it was in the early years of the 14th century. The medieval period was in full bloom, you see. Cathedrals rose toward heaven with Gothic spires, their stones reaching upward as if trying to touch something divine. Kings ruled from stone castles, their crowns heavy with the weight of authority. The church held dominion over the spiritual lives of millions, and the great feudal system kept society arranged in careful hierarchies. Lords and vassals, knights and peasants, all bound together by custom and obligation that had existed for centuries. For generations, the climate has been kind to Europe. The medieval warm period, as we might call it now, had blessed the continent with relatively stable, temperate conditions. Harvests had been plentiful, or at least predictable. Populations had grown. Towns had expanded. There was a sense, perhaps unspoken but deeply felt, that the world operated according to rules that people understood, that God was looking favorably upon Christendom, that tomorrow would be much like today, and the day after much like tomorrow. But beneath this seeming stability, unseen forces were already gathering. The climate, that great and patient master of all human affairs, was shifting. The warmth that had blessed Europe for centuries was beginning to fade. Deep in the Atlantic, great currents of water were beginning to move in different patterns. The sun's rays were falling at slightly different angles. These were changes so gradual, so vast, that no single person could perceive them. But like a sleeping giant stirring in its slumber, the climate was awakening to something new. The world, you see, was not as stable as people believed. And beginning in 1315, that hidden instability would reveal itself in the most dramatic and devastating way imaginable. Let us move forward now to the spring of that year. Picture yourself in the fields of England, in the valleys of France, in the farmlands of Germany and beyond. It was spring, that time of year when hope blooms as surely as the flowers in the meadows, when farmers look at their seed stores and imagine the abundance they will harvest come autumn. The planting season had begun, and across medieval Europe, peasants worked their lords' lands and their own small plots, hands in the dark earth, backs bent to the ancient rhythm of agricultural labor that had sustained civilization for thousands of years. The winter of 1314 and 1315 had been unusually cold, yes, but winters were often cold. Snow came, frost hardened the ground, and then spring arrived as it always did, bringing the hope of renewal. But this spring was different. Something was wrong, though few could name it. The rains came. At first, gentle showers that watered the tender shoots pushed up through the soil. Then the rains continued. Days of steady rainfall became weeks. The fields, which should have been warming and drying in the spring sun, remained waterlogged, muddy, heavy with moisture. The rain did not fall in the natural patterns people remembered from other years. It seemed to have developed a terrible persistence, as if the clouds themselves had forgotten how to part. In England, in the Midlands and the South, farmers watched helplessly as their fields transformed into something like bogs. The carefully prepared soil for spring planting had become waterlogged and cold. Seeds planted in such conditions do not thrive. They rot. They sit in the chill mud and simply decay, all potential lost. In France, the situation was equally grim. The Loire Valley, always so fertile and productive, was drowning in excess moisture. Chroniclers of the time, those monks and learned men who kept records of important events, began to notice that something was amiss. They noted the unusual weather in their careful handwriting, as if by recording it they could somehow understand or mitigate it. But understanding requires time, and this disaster would not wait. As the year progressed and summer approached, it became clear that this was not a temporary problem but a catastrophic failure. The harvests of 1315 were catastrophically reduced across nearly all of northern Europe. Where there should have been abundance, there was scarcity. Where farmers had expected to fill their stores with grain to see them through the winter, they found instead thin yields, weak crops, grain damaged by rot and moisture. The careful calculations that governed medieval life, how much grain to keep for seed, how much to sell, how much to store for winter, suddenly became impossible. There was simply not enough. Now, dear listener, to understand the true magnitude of what was about to happen, you must understand something about medieval life. There was no global trade network, no supermarkets with shelves stocked year-round, no refrigeration, no systems for moving food across vast distances. Each region, each community, depended almost entirely on what could be grown locally. A harvest failure was not a minor economic inconvenience. It was a crisis that threatened survival itself. Medieval people lived close to the edge, you see. They had learned through centuries of experience how to survive, how to store food, how to plan for hardship. But they had always assumed that if one harvest failed, the next would come. They had not imagined a failure that would stretch not across a single season, but across years. The winter of 1315 and 1316 arrived with terrible force. This was not merely a cold winter, though it was certainly that. This was a winter that seemed to arrive ahead of schedule and refused to leave. Snow fell and remained. The frost bit deep. And in the towns and villages of Europe, people began to experience something that many of them had never known before. True, gnawing hunger. Not the minor privations of a lean season, but real starvation. Chronicles from the time describe the scenes with a kind of shock that suggests the writers themselves could hardly believe what they were recording. People ate things that had never been considered food before. Tree bark was stripped and consumed. Grass was eaten. Roots were dug from the frozen ground with desperate hands. In some places, there were reports that people had turned to things we do not speak of in polite society, things that violated the deepest taboos of their faith and their culture, born of the kind of desperation that destroys reason and morality alike. Families faced impossible choices. The old and the very young, those least able to work and contribute, began to disappear. Some were abandoned on roadsides. Some died quietly in their homes. The great cities, which had grown in size and confidence during the warm centuries, became places of desperate suffering. Paris, that great capital of France, found itself surrounded by starving peasants. The urban poor, those who had migrated to the cities seeking opportunity, and instead found themselves dependent on markets for every scrap of food, began to die in notable numbers. The city tried to close its gates to protect its resources for its own citizens. But this only concentrated the suffering in those who were excluded, those left to huddle outside the walls. Prices for grain and other foodstuffs skyrocketed. Those merchants and wealthy landowners who had grain to sell found themselves in a position of terrifying power. A measure of wheat that had cost a few pence in good times now cost shillings. For someone without wealth, this was impossible. A laborer's wages could not stretch to purchase enough food to eat. And yet what choice existed? To steal was to risk execution. To beg was to be turned away. To die was the only certainty. The spring and summer of 1316 brought little relief. Again the rains came, though perhaps slightly less severe than the year before. Again the crops were damaged, though perhaps not quite as completely destroyed as in 1315. But it was not enough. 1 year of harvest failure could perhaps be survived through careful rationing and the consumption of grain stored from better years. But 2 years in succession, this pushed the system past its breaking point. In many regions, there was literally no grain left to plant for the following year. What had been stored away, either by individuals or by lords in their granaries, had been consumed in the attempt to survive. The seeds themselves, that precious grain that every farmer saves from harvest to harvest, knowing that without it there can be no new crop, had been eaten. Medieval Europe had entered into what would come to be known as the Great Famine, a crisis that would extend not merely across 2 bad years, but would cast its shadow across an entire decade. The immediate crisis of 1315 and 1316 was the most severe, but the effects would ripple outward and backward and forward through time in ways that no one could have predicted. In England, the records show that mortality was exceptionally high. Entire villages lost significant portions of their populations. In some areas, perhaps 10 to 15% of the population died during this period. In other places, particularly in more isolated or already marginal areas, the percentage was even higher. The Irish, always more precarious in their agricultural base than their English neighbors, suffered terribly. Chronicles describe scenes of horrific suffering. There are accounts of people literally starving in the midst of green fields, not because there was no food available to eat, but because the food that existed could not be accessed or belonged to someone else. The social fabric began to tear. In some places, there was a breakdown in the normal order of things. Bands of desperate people roamed the roads. Social hierarchies that had seemed immutable began to wobble slightly. If a lord had grain and his people were starving, what obligation did he have? The church taught charity, taught that one should help the poor and hungry. But it also taught obedience to authority, and accepted that God's will might include suffering and starvation. The moral clarity that might have compelled action dissolved into ambiguity and fear. And as we drift deeper into this story, dear listener, as we settle further into the comfortable darkness of this history, you might begin to sense that the Great Famine of 1315 was not merely a weather event or an agricultural disaster. It was a revelation. It revealed the fragility of the systems that supported medieval civilization. It revealed how dependent people were on the bounty of nature, how little control they truly had despite their kings and their churches and their confident hierarchies. It revealed, in a way that nothing else could, how quickly order could collapse when the basic necessities of life, food, warmth, security, were threatened. But there is more to this story, dear friends. The Great Famine was not merely a time of suffering and death, though it was certainly that. It was also a time of adaptation, of resilience, of the human capacity to endure even in the most difficult circumstances. It was also, in ways both subtle and profound, a turning point in European history. The medieval world that emerged from the devastation of 1315 to 1322 was not quite the same as the medieval world that had preceded it. Trust had been shaken. Confidence in the natural order had been damaged. And perhaps most importantly, the population had been reduced in such a way that demographic pressures that had been building would be relieved, at least temporarily. And yet, we must not rush ahead too quickly. The story has only truly begun. The winter of death was not merely cold, not merely wet, not merely the cause of starvation and suffering. It was also the precursor to something even darker, even more devastating. For in the wake of the Great Famine came plague, though that is a story for another time, another moment in our journey through the dark and fascinating corridors of medieval Europe. For now, rest, dear friends. Let your breathing slow. Let your body sink deeper into the comfort of your bed. The night is long, and the story, like all great stories, unfolds slowly, gently, revealing its mysteries one layer at a time. And so we continue our journey backward through time, deeper into the experience of those who lived through these years. Imagine, if you will, that you are a peasant. Let us call him Thomas, though this name could belong to thousands who lived and suffered during this period. Thomas is a man of perhaps 40 years old, which in the early 14th century would make him old indeed. He has survived childhood plagues, survived the ordinary hardships of medieval life, survived wars and taxes, and the arbitrary cruelties that the powerful sometimes inflicted upon the powerless. He has a wife named Margaret, and 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. They live in a small village in the Midlands of England, a cluster of perhaps 30 houses arranged around a church and a manor house where the Lord keeps his residence. Thomas's life before 1315 was not comfortable by the standards we might imagine today, but it was stable. He owed labor service to his Lord, perhaps 3 days a week working the Lord's fields, depending on the terms of his tenancy. The rest of his time he spent working his own small plot, the land that had been granted to him and his descendants in perpetuity, as long as he paid his obligations and maintained his loyalty. The plot was small, perhaps only a few acres, but it was enough, when combined with common rights to graze animals on the village commons and to gather firewood and other resources to sustain a family. There was never much surplus, never wealth or luxury, but there was sufficiency. The world was predictable in its unpredictability. Bad years came, yes, but they came and went. The rhythms of agricultural life were ancient and well understood. Then came 1315, and everything changed. Thomas watched that spring with growing anxiety as the rains continued and continued. He had seen wet springs before, but nothing quite like this. The mud in the fields clung to his shoes, making each step laborious. The seeds he had carefully planted, seeds he had saved from the previous year's crop, rotted in the wet earth. He could see them sometimes when he pulled up the soggy soil to inspect his work, little dark seeds turning into slime, dissolving into nothingness. All that hope, all that investment of effort and resources, simply disappearing. By autumn, it was clear that 1315 would be a disaster. The harvest was meager. What should have filled the storehouses, and the Lord's granaries instead barely covered half the expected yield. Thomas watched the Lord's stewards making their calculations, trying to determine how much grain to take in taxes and rents, how much to leave for the peasants, how much to keep in reserve for the manor's own consumption. The Lord himself was probably not present. Such lords often spent their time at the royal court or at other properties. It was the stewards and bailiffs who had to make the calculations of survival. In the end, Thomas received perhaps 3/4 of what he usually received from his own harvest. His Lord, following custom and law, took his share. The church took its tithe. And Thomas was left with grain that had to last until the next harvest, grain that had to be carefully rationed to feed a family of 5, plus a small amount to use as seed for the next year's planting. The mathematics of this situation were grim. He could not both feed his family adequately and save enough seed. He could not have both plenty and survival. Winter arrived, and with it came the cold and the snow. Thomas and his family huddled in their small cottage, a structure of wattle and daub with a thatched roof, humble by any standard, but it was home. The fire in the central hearth burned as much as they could afford, which was to say not very much. Firewood had to be gathered and carried, an endless task. His wife Margaret carefully rationed the food, preparing thin pottages and bread made with the grain they had stored. Each person received their share, calculated to sustain but not to satisfy. Hunger became a constant companion, a presence in the home as real as the cold. By December, Thomas began to notice that some of his neighbors were missing, not traveling or visiting other villages, simply gone. Some had likely fled, seeking work or charity elsewhere. Others had simply died. He heard that old William, who lived 3 houses down, had not been seen for a week. When someone finally checked his cottage, they found him dead, sitting by the cold hearth. He had simply run out of food and fuel, and the winter had taken him. The children grew listless. Thomas's youngest, a girl of 6 years named Eleanor, stopped playing. She spent her days sitting near the fire, her eyes large and dark in her thin face. Margaret tried to hide her own hunger, eating less so that the children would have more, a sacrifice that broke Thomas's heart each time he realized what she was doing. His sons, 8 and 10 years old, quarreled more easily, their tempers frayed by cold and hunger. And then came February, the cruelest month of a cruel winter. It was then that Thomas faced the choice that so many medieval parents faced during the Great Famine. He simply did not have enough food to feed his entire family until spring. The mathematics were impossible. He could save his oldest son and perhaps his wife and himself, but not the younger boy and Eleanor. Or he could try to distribute what little they had more evenly and watch all of them slowly starve together. Or he could do what so many were doing in those desperate times, reduce the number of mouths to feed. The thought was almost unbearable. Yet it was the thought that Thomas wrestled with during those long, dark nights of February and early March. We do not have many records from this period that speak directly to what people did, how they made these decisions, what they told themselves to justify the unjustifiable. But we know from fragmentary evidence, from oblique references in chronicles and records, that some families simply could not maintain all their members. Some children were sent away, given to monasteries or convents, or simply abandoned at the gates of larger towns in the hope that someone there might care for them. Some children died of deliberate neglect. Some did not receive their rations. Some parents, driven to desperation, made the choice that a family of 4 was more sustainable than a family of 5. Thomas did not abandon Eleanor. That grace, at least, was granted to him. Perhaps Margaret would have killed him first. Perhaps some deep instinct of humanity that even starvation could not entirely suppress held his hand. Instead, Eleanor simply received fewer calories than the others. The slow starvation was gentler than an active abandonment, if such a word can apply. In March, as the first hints of spring began to appear in the longer days and the slightly warmer afternoons, Eleanor developed a cough. By April, she was dead. Thomas and Margaret buried her in the churchyard, and the priest said words over her small form, and then she was gone from their lives. Thomas did not record his grief. There was no time for it. Spring had come, and with it came new urgency. He had saved no grain for seed. What would he plant? How could he plant anything if he had no seed? He went to his Lord and begged for grain to serve as seed. The Lord, facing his own crisis, his own stores depleted by the needs of his household and his obligations, eventually provided Thomas with some seed. But it was not given freely. It was a loan to be repaid after the next harvest at rates that seemed designed to ensure that Thomas would never fully recover. And the 1316 growing season was, if anything, worse than 1315. The rains came again. The crops failed again. And Thomas, already depleted by the previous year, found himself facing a second year of scarcity. But Thomas's story, while individually tragic and deeply human, is really only one story among millions. Across all of Northern Europe, variations of this narrative played out. The Great Famine did not affect all regions equally, and it did not affect all social classes equally. The nobility, with access to greater stores and the ability to commandeer grain and other resources, suffered less than the common people. A noble family might go hungry, might have to reduce their consumption and make difficult choices, but they were unlikely to starve. The church, too, with its networks of monasteries and convents, its land holdings and stores, had a better chance of survival than the secular population. It was the peasants, the common people, the urban poor, those with the least resources and the least flexibility, who bore the brunt of the disaster. Yet even among the nobility, the Great Famine had profound effects. It was not merely a matter of personal suffering, though suffering there was. The social and economic structures that bound medieval society together began to show signs of strain. The elaborate system of obligations and services that constituted feudalism was predicated on certain assumptions: that the land would produce, that there would be surplus, that the lord would have enough to maintain his household and his military retinue, and that the peasants would have enough to survive and continue working. When these assumptions were violated by the failure of harvests for 2 consecutive years, the whole system began to wobble. Some lords, facing unprecedented financial stress, began to demand more from their peasants. Where custom had dictated certain obligations, some lords began to demand additional services or higher rents, arguing that they needed to recoup their losses. This created tension and resentment. Some peasants, facing impossible situations, simply fled. They abandoned their holdings and moved to towns or to the lands of different lords, hopping for better circumstances elsewhere. This mass movement of population, though it did not reach the scale of modern migration, was significant enough that records note it. Some lords found their labor forces diminished at precisely the moment when reconstruction and recovery required more work, not less. In the towns and cities, the situation was equally dire but different in character. Urban populations depended on trade and markets for their food. When rural harvests failed, the supply of food to cities dried up. Merchants, controlling scarce grain, could charge whatever prices they wished. The urban poor found that their wages could not stretch to purchase enough food. Urban authorities, faced with starving populations in their streets and the threat of civil disorder, sometimes attempted to implement price controls or to provide poor relief. But these efforts were largely ad hoc and inadequate. In some cases, the authorities simply tried to drive the hungry out of the city, closing the gates and refusing entry to beggars and the destitute. Paris, that great capital, presents a particularly vivid picture of the urban crisis during the Great Famine. The city's population had grown dramatically during the warm, prosperous centuries. People had migrated to Paris seeking opportunity, seeking employment, seeking their fortune in the bustling markets and streets of the greatest city in Christendom. But when the harvests failed, all these people found themselves dependent on markets that no longer functioned normally. The grain that should have flowed into the city from the surrounding countryside simply did not come. Prices for bread, the staff of life, rose to levels that made it impossible for most people to purchase enough to eat. The Chronicles describe scenes of desperate poverty. Starving people collapsed in the streets. Children died of hunger. The city authorities, lacking any systematic way to deal with the crisis, focused mainly on maintaining order and protecting the property and interests of the wealthy. There are reports from Paris of desperate people gnawing on bones and leather. Reports of eating dogs and cats, animals usually considered unfit for human consumption. Reports of worse things too, things whispered and quickly suppressed, things that violated every law of God and nature. The Great Famine brought people to the edge of survival, to a place where the normal rules of society seemed almost irrelevant in the face of the immediate need to eat. And yet, even in the midst of this suffering, there were responses. There were attempts at understanding. There were ways in which people tried to impose meaning on what was happening. The church, as always, offered explanations. The famine was God's punishment for sin. The people were being tested. Repentance and prayer might earn divine mercy. Processions were organized, with people marching through the streets in chains, flagellating themselves as a form of penance. The idea was that if they suffered enough themselves, if they demonstrated sufficient repentance and devotion, God might relent and bring good harvests. There was a certain terrible logic to this response. After all, the church did not have a better explanation. Climate science did not exist. The concept of weather patterns or atmospheric circulation was not understood. What was understood was that God controlled the weather, that He sent rain and drought according to His will, and that humanity could influence God's decisions through prayer, penance, and righteousness. From this perspective, the famine was not an accident or a natural disaster, but a divine communication. God was trying to tell His people something. The question was what? Different people drew different conclusions. Some saw the famine as a call to greater piety and stricter adherence to church doctrine. Others began to question whether the church leadership itself might be corrupt, whether church leaders' sins might be drawing down God's wrath on the entire Christian world. This questioning, this doubt, would contribute to various heretical movements and would eventually contribute to the broader critiques that would lead to the Protestant Reformation centuries later. But in the immediate aftermath of the Great Famine, such grand historical movements were not yet visible. What was visible was suffering, and the various attempts of different groups to find meaning and to survive. The nobility, too, was affected not just materially but psychologically and socially. The Great Famine raised questions about the basis of aristocratic authority. If a noble lord could not provide for his people, if his lands could not produce food, what value did his noble status have? What was his role if not to protect and provide for those under his care? The medieval social order was not based purely on coercion or pure economic calculation. It was based also on a kind of social contract, an understanding that the Lord had obligations to His people, just as they had obligations to Him. When the Lord could not meet His obligations, could not provide sufficiency. The entire moral basis of the relationship was called into question. Some peasants, emboldened by the Lord's own difficulties and by their own desperate circumstances, began to resist demands for additional labor or additional rents. Small rebellions and acts of defiance, though usually quickly suppressed, began to appear. These early stirrings would eventually contribute to the broader peasant rebellions that would punctuate the late medieval period, particularly the famous Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. The Great Famine did not cause these rebellions directly, but it shook the foundations of the feudal system in ways that became more apparent as time went on. The Great Famine also had profound effects on the relationship between Christians and Jewish communities in Europe. In times of crisis, people often seek someone to blame. Jews, as a non-Christian minority living within Christian societies, were vulnerable to such blame. In some regions, particularly in the Germanic areas, there were outbreaks of violence against Jewish communities. People blamed Jews for causing the famine through sorcery or divine punishment for not accepting Christianity. These pogroms, though not necessarily directly caused by the famine itself, were certainly intensified by the social stress and desperation that the famine created. In the Iberian Peninsula, which had a somewhat different climate and agricultural pattern from northern Europe, the effects of the Great Famine were less severe. Yet even there, the crisis had ripple effects. Trade was disrupted. The movement of goods and people was constrained. The sense of crisis that permeated northern Europe was felt in diminished form in the south as well. By 1317, the immediate crisis had begun to pass. Harvests, while still somewhat below normal, had improved. The worst of the starvation was over. People began to emerge from their homes to bury their dead, to attempt to reconstruct their lives and their communities. But the damage had been done. Hundreds of thousands had died. Families had been shattered. The confidence in the natural order and in the stability of the world had been damaged in a way that would take generations to overcome. The population of Europe had been reduced significantly. Estimates suggest that the Great Famine killed somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population of northern Europe, with some regions suffering even higher mortality rates. In Ireland, the effect was even more severe, with perhaps 10 to 15% of the population perishing. In terms of absolute numbers, this means that between 1 and 2 million people died across Europe during the famine years, most of them between 1315 and 1322. This massive die-off had consequences that echoed forward through time. In the short term, it relieved some of the population pressure that had been building during the warm, prosperous centuries. Land became more available. Labor became slightly less abundant, which meant that surviving peasants had somewhat more bargaining power than they had had before. But these changes took years to become apparent, and in the immediate aftermath of the famine, what people felt was simply loss. As the crisis gradually subsided, people began the difficult work of reconstruction. Families that had been broken apart attempted to reunite. Communities that had lost significant portions of their populations attempted to repopulate themselves. Lords attempted to restore their economies. The church began to process what had happened, to incorporate the famine into its understanding of God's ways and humanity's place in the world. And yet, dear friends, as you rest there in the peaceful darkness of your room, as your breathing continues to slow and deepen, I must tell you that this was not quite the end of the story. The Great Famine was terrible, yes, but it was not the worst thing that medieval Europe would face. In fact, the reduction in population caused by the Great Famine would create conditions that, in a terrible and ironic way, would make possible an even greater catastrophe. The very relief from population pressure, the very recovery of agriculture that took place in the 1320s and 1330s, would create the conditions for the transmission and spread of disease on a scale never before seen. But that is another chapter in our long journey through history, another part of the story that unfolds slowly, layer by layer, like the pages of an ancient manuscript being turned by careful hands. Let us pause here for a moment, dear listeners, and take a breath together. Allow yourself to sink deeper into your bed, to feel the weight of the blankets upon you, the softness of the pillows beneath your head. The story continues, but slowly, gently, carrying you along like a river flowing toward an inevitable sea. There is no rush. The night is long, and we have time. Now, as we move forward from the immediate crisis of the Great Famine, I want to help you understand something crucial about how history works. We often think of major events as isolated incidents. The famine was terrible, and then it was over. But history is not really like that. History is like a stone dropped into still water. It creates ripples that spread outward, ripples that interact with other ripples, creating patterns that continue long after the original disturbance has subsided. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was the stone, but the ripples it created would extend far beyond those years. Consider, if you will, the state of Europe in the years immediately following the famine. The immediate starvation had ended, yes, but the trauma remained. Families that had lost children grieved. Communities that had lost significant portions of their population struggled to rebuild. The bonds of social trust, which had been severely tested, needed time to heal. People were hungry for stability, for a return to the way things had been before, or for some assurance that such a catastrophe would not recur. Yet, in a strange and counterintuitive way, the massive die-off created opportunities. As brutal and terrible as it was, the reduction in population actually relieved some of the stress that had been building on medieval society. The population of Europe had been growing steadily for centuries. More people meant more pressure on the land, more competition for resources, more mouths to feed from the same amount of agricultural production. By the early 14th century, parts of Europe were becoming crowded. Land was becoming scarce. The easy opportunities that had existed for expansion and settlement were beginning to disappear. The Great Famine changed this calculus overnight. Millions of people died. Suddenly, there was more land per person. Suddenly, labor was slightly scarcer and therefore more valuable. Surviving peasants found that they had a bit more bargaining power. They could, in some cases, move to different lords' lands and negotiate better terms. The acute pressure that had built up was suddenly released. In the years following the famine, the 1320s, 1330s, and 1340s, Europe began to recover and in many ways to flourish. Agriculture rebounded as weather patterns became somewhat more favorable, and as the reduced population meant that the land could be more effectively worked by the survivors. Trade revived. Populations began to grow again, more slowly than before the famine, but steadily. Towns and cities expanded once more. The building of cathedrals and churches resumed. There was a sense, in the decades after the Great Famine, that the worst had passed, that the world was healing. But unbeknownst to anyone at the time, new danger was gathering. Far away from Europe, in the steppes of Central Asia and in the trading ports of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, something was stirring. Something ancient, something that had plagued humanity for centuries, something that had been held in check by chance and circumstance, was beginning to spread. Plague was on the move. The plague bacterium, we now know, lived in the bodies of rodents, particularly rats and ground squirrels. It was transmitted to humans through the bites of fleas that lived on these animals. For centuries, plague had existed in isolated pockets, in Central Asia, in parts of Africa, in limited areas where the conditions were right for transmission, and the human population was sparse enough that the disease could not sustain itself on a large scale. But as trade expanded, as people moved along the Silk Roads and the maritime routes of the Mediterranean, as merchants and soldiers and refugees traveled between distant lands, the conditions for a catastrophic spread began to develop. There were outbreaks of plague in various parts of Asia and the Middle East in the years after the Great Famine. These outbreaks, while devastating locally, did not immediately affect Europe. But they were spreading eastward and westward along the trade routes, and by the late 1340s, plague had reached the Black Sea region, where Genoese merchants maintained trading posts and colonies. The story of how plague reached Europe proper is a fascinating one, and there are many versions of it, some more reliable than others. The most likely scenario is that plague was brought to the Black Sea region by merchants and travelers from Asia, possibly through Central Asia or through the steppes. In the trading posts and ports of the Black Sea, particularly in the Genoese colony of Kaffa, in what is now Crimea, plague began to spread through the rat and flea populations that inhabited the port cities. And as it had been doing for centuries wherever humans and plague came into close contact, it spilled over into the human population. The first documented mention of plague in the Black Sea region comes from 1347. In that year, a Genoese trading post at Kaffa was under siege by a Mongol army. As the story goes, the Mongol forces were themselves suffering from plague. Desperate for a way to break the siege and infect their enemies, the Mongols catapulted the bodies of plague victims into the Genoese settlement. The Genoese, horrified and faced with both a military siege and the onset of epidemic disease, abandoned their position and fled by ship. Many of them were already infected, carrying the plague bacillus in their bodies, harboring the fleas that would spread the disease to new hosts. The ships sailed westward across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. They docked at ports in the Genoese homeland in Italy, and there, In the autumn of 1347, the plague entered Europe. What happened next was, in many ways, worse than the Great Famine had been. If the famine was a slow catastrophe, a grinding disaster that played out over years of hunger and starvation, plague was a sudden, shocking, almost incomprehensible catastrophe. It struck with speed. It struck with a mortality rate that seemed almost deliberately cruel. It struck with a randomness that made it impossible to predict who would survive and who would not. And it struck at a moment when Europe had just begun to recover from the Great Famine, when people had begun to believe that the worst was behind them. Let me paint for you a picture of what plague was like for someone experiencing it for the first time, dear friends. Imagine you are living in a port city, let us say Venice or Genoa or Messina, one of the great Mediterranean trading centers. The ships arrive from the Black Sea, and at first no one thinks anything is particularly unusual about them. Ships arrive regularly from the east, bringing silk and spices and other exotic goods. But within days, sometimes within hours, it becomes apparent that something is very wrong. The sailors who disembarked from the ships began to fall ill. At first it seems like just ordinary sickness, the kind of illness that afflicts sailors after long voyages. But then more sailors become sick, and then the illness spreads to the families of the sailors, to the dock workers, to the merchants who have come to inspect the cargo. And the symptoms of this illness are unlike anything most people have ever seen. The sick develop buboes, swollen lymph nodes that can swell to the size of an apple or an egg, turning dark purple or black with the dying tissue beneath the skin. The buboes appear in the groin, the armpits, the neck. They are intensely painful. In some cases they burst, oozing pus and blood. The sick develop high fevers. They become delirious, hallucinating, speaking in tongues. Their skin takes on a dark, almost blackened appearance as blood vessels rupture beneath the surface. Many victims vomit blood. Many have severe diarrhea, sometimes so severe that the body simply seems to be draining away from the inside. And then, within days, sometimes within a week, but often much faster, the sick person is dead. The mortality rate of untreated plague is extraordinarily high. Of those who develop the bubonic form of plague, perhaps 60 to 90% will die without antibiotic treatment. Of those who develop the pneumonic form, plague that affects the lungs and can be spread directly through the air via coughing, the mortality rate approaches 100%. Of those who develop septicemic plague, where the infection enters the bloodstream and the bacteria spread throughout the body, the mortality rate is also nearly universal. People watching this unfold had no framework for understanding it. The germ theory of disease did not exist. People did not know about bacteria or viruses or infections in the way we understand them now. What they saw was people becoming suddenly, catastrophically ill and dying with terrible swiftness. What they heard were theories, all of which were wrong, but which seemed at the time plausible. Some blamed the positions of the planets. Some blamed bad air. The word miasma, corrupted air that carried disease, became common. Some blamed the Jews and terrible pogroms resulted. Some blamed the lepers and leper colonies were attacked. Some blamed the poor, the sick, the marginalized, anyone and everyone except, of course, themselves or their own groups. What actually happened was that plague spread through the flea and rat populations in the ports and cities. And from there, it spread along the trade routes and the roads that connected medieval Europe's cities and towns. The disease traveled with merchants, with pilgrims, with refugees, with anyone who moved from place to place. It traveled especially quickly along the Mediterranean coast and up the river valleys of France and Italy and Germany. By 1348, plague was in southern France. By 1349, it had reached Paris and northern Europe. By 1350, it had penetrated into the British Isles and into Central Europe. By 1351, it had reached as far north as Scandinavia and as far east as the Polish territories. And wherever it went, it brought death on a scale that was almost unimaginable. The mortality was staggering. In some cities, death rates reached 50, 60, even 70% of the population. Florence, one of the great cities of Italy, lost perhaps 2/3 of its inhabitants in the course of a few years. In some smaller towns, the death rate was even higher. Entire communities were nearly or completely depopulated. In some places, there were so many dead and so few survivors that the dead could not be properly buried. Mass graves were dug. The bodies were piled in without ceremony or proper preparation. The smell of death must have hung over the cities like a pall. The social order began to collapse. When perhaps half the population is dying, when death is visiting every house, when everyone is terrified and grieving and desperate, the normal functioning of society becomes difficult or impossible. Trade largely ceased. Food production suffered. Many farms were abandoned as peasants fled or died. People fled the cities, seeking safety in the countryside, only to bring plague with them. People fled the countryside, seeking the resources and help they imagined might exist in cities, only to find plague worse there. There was no escape. The disease pursued people everywhere. Doctors, when consulted by those who could afford them, were largely helpless. Their understanding of medicine was based on the theory of the four humors, the idea that illness resulted from an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments included bloodletting, which, by draining the patient of blood, actually hastened death. Leeches were applied. Poultices of herbs and strange substances were recommended. None of it worked. The patients died anyway, sometimes faster than they would have without treatment. The Church, which had provided some framework for understanding the Great Famine, struggled to make sense of plague. Some religious authorities suggested it was divine punishment, and that repentance and prayer might help. Others suggested that the sacraments and the Church's rituals might provide protection or cure. But the plague killed priests and bishops just as readily as it killed peasants. The disease did not respect piety or rank. This created a profound crisis of faith for many people. How could God allow this? What sin had humanity committed that was so terrible that it deserved this punishment? Or perhaps, and this was a dangerous thought, a thought that could get one in trouble with the authorities, Perhaps God was not all-powerful, or perhaps he did not care, or perhaps the church's assurances of divine protection and guidance were simply false. In the aftermath of plague, we find the rise of various movements, some heretical, some within the church but pushing at its boundaries. There were the flagellants, men and women who roamed from town to town, publicly whipping themselves and each other to atone for humanity's sins. There were claims that angels had revealed secret knowledge. There were apocalyptic movements. People were searching for some explanation, some response, some way to make sense of the senseless dying. And through it all, the plague continued. The initial wave, which began in 1347 and peaked in the mid-1350s, killed somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people. Europe, with a population of perhaps 75 million at the time, lost roughly 30 to 60% of its population. Some estimates are even higher. In absolute terms, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone died in the first wave of plague. Add to this the deaths in Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, and the death toll approaches 100 million or perhaps even exceeds it. To understand what this meant, dear friends, imagine that 9 out of every 10 people you knew, your family, your friends, your neighbors, your entire community, were dead. Imagine entire villages where only a handful of people survived. Imagine cities where the death was so rapid that the living could not keep up with burying the dead. Imagine that situation persisting not for a few weeks or months, but for years. That is what the Black Death was, and it would return again and again in subsequent waves for centuries to come. The Great Famine had been terrible. It had killed millions. It had shattered families and communities. It had traumatized an entire generation. But the Black Death, which arrived in its wake, was apocalyptic. It was, in the perspective of those who lived through it, almost the end of the world. And yet, dear listeners, as I watch you lying there in your beds, as I imagine your breathing becoming deeper and slower, I want you to know that there is something almost redemptive about this story, something that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. Because Europe did not end. Humanity did not disappear. Out of the devastation of plague came recovery, transformation, and eventually the Renaissance and the early modern world. The catastrophe, terrible as it was, also cleared away old patterns and old structures, creating space for new possibilities. But that recovery was neither immediate nor inevitable. In the decades immediately following the initial wave of plague, Europe was still reeling from the shock. The world seemed broken. The population was devastated. The economy was in turmoil. And yet, slowly, gradually, people began to rebuild. To understand the recovery that followed plague, we must first understand what the immediate aftermath looked like. Picture, if you will, a landscape of abandonment. Fields that had been carefully tended for generations lay fallow and untended. Villages that had housed families for hundreds of years stood half empty, their cottages falling into disrepair. Churches that had been the center of community life stood with their doors locked, their priests dead or fled. The roads, which had always carried travelers and merchants, were now frequented mostly by wanderers and refugees. Entire regions were depopulated to the point where some areas seemed almost empty of human presence. In the cities, the situation was somehow both better and worse. The cities, having lost perhaps 50 to 70% of their population, were shells of their former selves. The great merchant houses that had dominated trade were gone, their owners and their workers dead. The guilds that had carefully controlled the production of goods found themselves depleted of skilled workers. The great cathedrals that had dominated the skyline stood as monuments to a grandeur that seemed now impossibly distant. Yet the cities also represented opportunity for survivors. With the death of so many, skilled workers became scarce and therefore valuable. With so much land and property vacant, and with the legal heirs often dead, there were opportunities for people of modest means to acquire property and resources. In the countryside, a strange and counterintuitive thing began to happen. The peasants, who had always been the largest portion of the population, and who had always labored under the burden of heavy obligations to their lords, suddenly found themselves with unexpected leverage. There were far fewer of them now, but they were suddenly essential. Fields needed to be worked, harvests needed to be brought in, yet there were not enough hands to do the work. For the first time in centuries, peasants found themselves in a position where their labor was genuinely scarce and therefore genuinely valuable. Some peasants, recognizing this new reality, began to demand higher wages. Some fled their lords' lands and sought employment elsewhere, knowing that other lords, desperate to keep their estates productive, would be willing to offer better terms. Some, more boldly, refused to perform the customary labor services that feudalism required. A lord with 90% of his peasants dead could not easily coerce those who remained into compliance if those peasants were willing to abandon their holdings and seek work elsewhere. This created a fundamental crisis in the feudal system. Feudalism, as a system, depended on the subordination of peasants to lords, on the peasants' lack of alternatives, on custom and obligation enforced through both economic necessity and coercion. But when peasants had alternatives, when labor was scarce, when the economic incentives lined up differently, the system began to strain. Peasants began to demand better treatment. In some cases, they received it. Some lords, recognizing that they needed to retain their labor force, began to offer higher wages, better conditions, and fewer obligations. This transformation did not happen overnight, and it was far from universal. In some regions, lords attempted to maintain the old system through coercion and law. They tried to enforce wage controls, attempting to keep wages at pre-plague levels. They tried to enforce regulations that would prevent peasants from fleeing their lands. They tried, in essence, to deny the new economic reality that plague had created. But these efforts ultimately failed. The market for labor had changed, and no amount of legislation could permanently reverse that change. In England, these tensions erupted dramatically in 1381, in the form of the Peasants' Revolt. Triggered by a poll tax that seemed to place excessive burdens on the common people, and animated by decades of tension between peasants seeking better treatment and lords attempting to maintain the old hierarchies. Tens of thousands of peasants rose up. They marched on London. They confronted the young King Richard II. They demanded changes to the feudal system. Though the rebellion was ultimately suppressed and its leaders were executed, the event represented something important. The old order was no longer automatically accepted. Peasants were willing to resist, to demand change, to imagine alternative arrangements. In France, too, there were peasant rebellions, the Jacquerie of 1358 and other uprisings that reflected the same underlying tensions. The nobility, faced with peasant resistance and with the challenges of maintaining their authority in a depopulated landscape, found their position weakened in ways that would take generations to work out fully. The secure feudal hierarchy that had seemed so natural and inevitable before the plague now seemed fragile and contingent. But let us step back from the grand historical movements for a moment and return to the human level, where the recovery from plague was lived and experienced in deeply personal ways. Imagine you are Margaret, our character from before, a woman who survived both the Great Famine and the Black Death. She was a girl during the famine, and the horror of that time marked her. She watched people starve. She learned early what it meant when food ran out. She learned to be careful, to ration, to expect suffering. Then the plague came. Margaret was perhaps in her 30s or 40s by then, a woman living in a small town. She watched plague arrive. She watched it take her neighbors, her family, people she had known her whole life. In the space of a few months, perhaps half the town was dead. There was no avoiding it. Everyone lost someone. Margaret herself became sick. She developed a terrible fever. She vomited blood. She felt as if her body was burning from within. She expected to die, but she lived. Why? We do not know. Plague was not entirely predictable in its victims. Some people caught it and died within days. Others caught it and survived, recovering after weeks of terrible illness. Margaret was one of the survivors, and in her survival there was a kind of grace, though it did not feel that way at the time. It felt like luck, and luck is not grace. After the plague passed, after the worst of it was over, Margaret found herself in a strange and disorienting world. Most of her family was gone. Her husband, if she had one, was dead. Several of her children were dead. The world was simultaneously empty and full of new possibilities. There was land available, so much land, because so many people had died and no one remained to claim their property. There were resources available. There were opportunities, but there was also profound grief, trauma, and disorientation. Margaret would have spent years, perhaps the rest of her life, carrying the weight of those losses. The Great Famine had taught her that the world was not safe, that suffering could come suddenly and unexpectedly. Plague had confirmed that lesson in the most terrible way possible. For someone like Margaret, the world would never quite feel solid or safe again. She would have been hyper-vigilant about her health, about her resources, about her ability to survive. She would have remembered the times when there was not enough food and plague, and when everything seemed fragile. Yet Margaret would also have adapted. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of tremendous resilience in the face of catastrophe. Margaret would have found work, perhaps more work than she could have found before, when there were so many more people competing for employment. Perhaps she remarried if she had been widowed. Perhaps she acquired some property. Perhaps she experienced, for the first time in her life, some modest degree of security and even comfort. Plague had devastated Europe, but it had also, in a strange way, created opportunities for people like Margaret. Now, as you rest there in the darkness, dear listeners, I want to help you understand something about how societies recover from catastrophe. Recovery is never simple or straightforward. It involves both progress and loss, both hope and grief, both new opportunities and lingering trauma. It is messy and complicated and takes far longer than people expect. In the decades following the Black Death's initial wave, Europe began a slow process of repopulation. Survival rates improved as the plague, while never entirely disappearing, became less catastrophic. People began to have more children, or rather, more children survived to adulthood. The population, which had been devastated, began to grow again. By 1400, perhaps 75 years after the initial plague outbreak, the population of Europe had recovered somewhat, though it was still well below pre-plague levels. It would take until the 16th century for the European population to return to where it had been before 1347. But while the population was recovering, the world was also changing in other ways. The plague had accelerated certain trends and disrupted others. Trade, which had been severely disrupted during the plague years, gradually revived, but trade routes had changed. Some of the old commercial networks that had linked Europe to Asia through the Silk Roads were disrupted by the chaos that plague had created in Central Asia and the Middle East. Instead, merchants began to look toward the sea. The development of improved ship designs and navigation techniques in the 15th century would make possible the oceanic voyages that would lead to the Age of Discovery. The plague also affected intellectual and cultural life. The universities and centers of learning that had existed before plague were disrupted and in many cases destroyed. Scholars died. Libraries burned or were neglected. Yet as Europe recovered, there was a surge of intellectual activity. The surviving scholars, the monks who had preserved knowledge in monasteries, the growing merchant class that had accumulated wealth and could patronize arts and learning, all of these factors contributed to what we now call the Renaissance, that great flowering of arts, letters, and learning that began in Italy in the 14th century and gradually spread throughout Europe. The Renaissance was, in some ways, built on the bones of plague. The catastrophe had cleared away old patterns. It had disrupted established hierarchies. It has created space for new ideas and new ways of thinking. The humanist scholars who drove the Renaissance were, in many cases, responding to the philosophical and spiritual crisis that plague had created. How does one make sense of a world in which divine punishment seems arbitrary and universal? How does one understand God's nature in the face of such suffering? These questions drove people to look back to classical sources, to Greek and Roman philosophy and literature, seeking alternatives to the medieval worldview that had failed to adequately explain or address the catastrophe. We also see changes in art and culture. The art of the post-plague period often has a different character from medieval art that preceded it. There is a new emphasis on realism, on depicting human bodies and emotions with greater accuracy and intensity. The theme of death became central to post-plague art, the dance macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons dance with the living, reminding them of their mortality. This was not morbidity for its own sake. It was a way of processing trauma, of making sense of the devastation that had been experienced. In the economic realm, the recovery from plague changed the balance of power between different groups in medieval society. The nobility, which had dominated medieval Europe, found its position weakened by the abundance of land and the scarcity of labor. The merchant class, which controlled commerce and could adapt more quickly to changing conditions, found its position strengthened. By the 15th century, wealthy merchants in cities like Venice, Florence, and Bruges were wielding power that rivaled or exceeded that of traditional nobility. This shift would eventually contribute to the rise of the modern state and the decline of feudalism, though these processes would take centuries to fully play out. The church, too, was affected by plague and the recovery that followed. During the plague itself, the church had been discredited in some ways. Its assurances had not prevented the catastrophe, and priests had died just as readily as anyone else. In the aftermath, there was more questioning of church authority, more demands for reform, more willingness to challenge traditional church teachings. These currents would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, though that was still far in the future. In the immediate aftermath of plague, the church was reforming itself, attempting to address the moral and spiritual crisis that the catastrophe had created. One other crucial development in the post-plague world deserves mention: the growth of secular authority and the emergence of the modern nation-state. Before plague, authority in Europe was fragmented and largely personal. Kings and nobles ruled their territories, but power was decentralized and often contested. The church also wielded enormous power, competing with secular rulers for authority and allegiance. Plague disrupted this system. As populations recovered, rulers found that they needed more centralized authority to manage their territories effectively. They needed standing armies, professional bureaucracies, systems for taxation and resource allocation that went beyond the feudal networks. These needs drove the development of stronger, more centralized states. In France, in England, in Spain and Portugal, in the emerging states of Central Europe, everywhere, we see the gradual development of stronger central authority. This is not to say that the process was linear or inevitable. There were civil wars and conflicts over succession. There were rebellions and revolutions in miniature, but the overall trend was toward stronger, more centralized nation-states. By the 16th century, the feudal system was largely obsolete, replaced by a system of national states competing for power and resources. Now, as you lie there in the darkness, as the story settles over you like a blanket, I want you to understand something important. The Great Famine and the Black Death were catastrophes beyond what most of us can easily imagine. They killed tens of millions of people. They shattered societies and disrupted the normal functioning of civilization. They were, in many ways, the worst disasters that medieval Europe experienced. And yet, out of that catastrophe came transformation. The old medieval world, with all its hierarchies and certainties and deeply rooted inequalities, was damaged by these events in ways that could never be fully repaired. In its place, gradually, over centuries, a new world emerged. It was not a perfect world, and it brought new problems and new inequalities. But it was different. It was shaped, in ways both large and small, by the catastrophes of 1315 and 1347, and the years that followed. This is one of the profound lessons of history, dear friends. Catastrophe, as terrible as it is, can be transformative. It can destroy old certainties and open space for new possibilities. It can humble the powerful and create opportunities for the humble. It does not redeem the suffering. Nothing could do that. But it does show us that even in the darkest moments, in the face of the most overwhelming disasters, humanity has the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to build something new. But let us linger a moment longer in the immediate aftermath of plague, because there is something in that space that I want to help you understand more deeply. There is something about the experience of survival and recovery that speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit. Imagine yourself as a survivor of plague, living perhaps in the 1360s or 1370s, a decade or two after the initial catastrophe. You have lived through the worst thing you can imagine. You have buried children. You have watched friends and family members die in agony. You have seen entire communities decimated. You have felt the terrible weight of mortality bearing down on everyone around you, and the knowledge that you yourself could be next has been with you constantly. And then, gradually, the crisis passes. The plague does not entirely disappear. It will return in waves, every few years or decades, bringing new deaths and new suffering. But the catastrophic initial outbreak is over. Life, somehow, continues. There is food available. The worst of the starvation is past. There is work to be done, and therefore there is purpose. There are survivors like yourself, people who have lived through the same horrors, and there is a kind of community that grows from shared trauma and survival. What must it have felt like to survive? To live in a world where you have witnessed death on such a scale that normal human emotions seem almost inadequate. There must have been a strange kind of relief, the feeling that you had been spared, that you had made it through. But there must also have been profound guilt. Why did you survive when so many others died? What made you special or worthy when so many who seemed equally worthy or more so had perished? This is the survivor's burden, and it is real and deep. In the psychological aftermath of plague, we see the development of new religious movements and new forms of spirituality. The flagellants, whom I mentioned earlier, were one response, a literal attempt to atone for survival, to join in the suffering that others had experienced, to prostrate oneself before God and beg for mercy. There were also apocalyptic movements, groups of believers who expected the world to end, who saw plague as a sign of the end times. And there were, paradoxically, movements of celebration and joy. People who had survived were determined to live fully, to experience pleasure, to make the most of the time that remained to them. This combination of grief and joy, of penance and celebration, appears in the culture that emerges in the post-plague period. The literature of the 14th and 15th centuries is full of references to death, to mortality, to the fragility of life. But it is also full of celebration of human experience, of love and beauty, and the sensory pleasures of life. The great poets and writers of the period, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Chaucer, all grappled with these themes. Their works reflect the psychological state of survivors living in the shadow of catastrophe. The Decameron, written by Boccaccio in the years after plague, is a perfect example. The work is framed as a story of 10 young people who flee Florence during a plague outbreak and retreat to a country villa, where they spend their time telling stories and enjoying the pleasures of good company and good food. The work could be read as escapism, a retreat from the horrors of the real world into a fantasy of beauty and pleasure. But it is more complex than that. It is also a way of processing trauma, a way of imagining recovery, a way of suggesting that life can be lived and enjoyed even in the knowledge of death and suffering. This same combination appears in visual art. We see images of religious suffering and penance, images of the dance macabre where death dances with the living. But we also see increasingly realistic and beautiful depictions of the human form, increasing attention to landscape and natural beauty, increasing celebration of human achievement and capability. The art of the period reflects a people who have stared into the abyss and have not looked away, but have also chosen to continue living. Now, I want to draw your attention to something subtle but important about the world that emerged from the catastrophes of 1315 to 1347 and their aftermath. The world that existed before, the high medieval world, the world of the early 14th century, had been characterized by a certain kind of confidence. There was a church that claimed absolute spiritual authority. There were kings and nobles who ruled according to tradition and accepted hierarchies. There was a sense that the world was ordered, that everyone had their place, that society was built on natural and divinely ordained foundations. The catastrophes of famine and plague shattered that confidence. They revealed the fragility of human institutions. They showed that death could come suddenly and universally, that no amount of piety or nobility could protect you, that the systems people had built their lives upon could fail catastrophically. This realization, this shattered confidence, is one of the great intellectual and spiritual events of European history, though it is often not discussed in those terms. In a strange way, the catastrophes of 1315 and the decades following created the intellectual and emotional foundations for the modern world. The modern world is characterized by a certain kind of skepticism toward authority, by an emphasis on individual experience and individual reason, rather than on unquestioned tradition. The seeds of this skepticism were planted in many ways by plague and famine. If the church could not protect you from plague, if the established social order could not prevent famine and mass death, then perhaps these institutions were not as infallible as they claimed to be. Perhaps reason and individual effort mattered more than unquestioning obedience to authority. This is not to say that the medieval world was naive or unquestioning in its entirety. Medieval people were often quite sophisticated in their thinking. But there was a difference in degree. After the plague, skepticism became more widespread, more normalized. The great intellectual and spiritual movements that followed, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, all grew in part from this soil of shattered confidence in medieval certainties. I want to paint for you another picture now, dear listeners. Imagine yourself not as a survivor of plague in the 1360s, but as a scholar or a monk living in the early 15th century, perhaps in Florence or Rome, 100 years after the initial plague outbreak. The worst of the crisis is now in the past, though living memory may still include stories of plague. The population has recovered somewhat. Trade has revived. Wealth has been accumulated by successful merchants. And you are part of a movement of thinkers and scholars who are dedicated to recovering and studying the texts of classical antiquity, the works of Plato and Aristotle and the Roman authors. Why would someone in the 15th century be interested in studying ancient Greek and Roman texts? In part, it was because the Middle Ages had not preserved all of these texts and had often lost or neglected them. But more than that, I think, it was because people in the post-plague world were looking for alternative ways of thinking about the world and about humanity. The medieval worldview had been shattered. Medieval interpretations of ancient philosophy and literature, filtered through the lens of Christian theology, no longer seemed entirely adequate. Perhaps by going back directly to the classical sources, by reading Plato and Aristotle without the medieval Christian intermediary, one could discover new ways of understanding the world. This is the intellectual foundation of the Renaissance, this combination of recovering lost texts and of searching for new ways of thinking prompted by the inadequacy of the old world view in the face of catastrophe. The Renaissance was, in many ways, a recovery of the past. But it was a recovery motivated by the needs of the present, by the need to find new ways of thinking about a world that had proven to be far more fragile and chaotic than medieval people had believed. And this movement of intellectual recovery and innovation spread from Italy to the rest of Europe. By the 16th century, the ideas of the Renaissance had penetrated into France, Germany, England, and beyond. Universities that had been disrupted by plague were revived and reformed. New universities were founded. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, allowed for the rapid spread of ideas and texts. The world of learning and culture was transformed. But let us not get too caught up in the grand movements of intellectual history. Let us return once more to the human level, to the lived experience of people in the post-plague world. I want to tell you about the recovery of everyday life, because it is in these everyday recoveries that we see the resilience of humanity most clearly. In the countryside, after the initial wave of plague had passed, peasants had to face the practical question of how to restore agricultural production. Fields had been abandoned. Some had begun to return to wilderness, with weeds and wild plants reclaiming the carefully tended soil. Equipment had been lost or damaged. seed stocks had been depleted. Yet somehow, over the course of years and decades, production was restored. Survivors worked to clear overgrown fields. They gathered seeds and replanted. They rebuilt equipment. Gradually, the landscape that had been abandoned began to fill with human activity once more. In the towns and cities, similar processes of recovery took place. Ruined buildings were salvaged for materials or simply rebuilt. Shops and markets that had been closed reopened. Craftspeople who had survived began to ply their trades. The economic relationships that had been shattered by plague gradually reformed, though often in different configurations than before. One interesting aspect of post-plague recovery was the attitude toward labor. Because labor was scarce, working people found that they had leverage they had not had before. Wages rose. Working conditions improved in some places. In some towns, craft workers were able to enforce higher standards and restrict competition. This improvement in the lot of working people, though temporary and limited in scope, represented a real change from the pre-plague world. It was one of the more positive developments to emerge from the catastrophe. The fact that survivors, in the scarce labor market created by plague, could demand better treatment and often receive it. There was also significant migration in the post-plague period. Because the population had been so drastically reduced, there was more empty land available. Some people abandoned their traditional homes and moved to new areas, seeking better opportunities or simply seeking to escape the memories of the plague years. This migration helped to distribute the surviving population more effectively, and also helped to establish new communities in areas that had previously been sparsely populated. In this process of recovery and rebuilding, we also see the development of new technologies and practices. Because labor was scarce, there was greater incentive to develop mechanical solutions to problems. We see developments in agriculture, in milling, in various crafts, people seeking to do more with fewer workers. These technological developments, while not revolutionary in any single instance, cumulatively contributed to increasing productivity and efficiency in the post-plague economy. There was also, in many regions, a shift in the types of agriculture being practiced. Before plague, in the high medieval period, the emphasis had been largely on grain production: wheat, barley, rye. After plague, with a reduced population, there was less pressure to maximize grain production. In some regions, there was a shift toward pastoral agriculture, raising livestock for meat, wool, and other products. This shift had long-term consequences for European agriculture and economy, contributing to the development of wool and cloth production as major industries. Now, as you drift deeper into sleep, dear friends, as the story settles more fully into the darkness of the night, I want to help you understand the long-term legacy of the Great Famine and the Black Death. These were catastrophes that occurred more than 650 years ago, events that are separated from our own time by more than a dozen generations. Why should they matter to us now? Why should we spend our energy thinking about them? I think there are several reasons. First, these events show us something fundamental about the nature of human societies and human resilience. Catastrophes of terrible magnitude can strike, and yet humanity survives. The systems that support civilization can fail dramatically, and yet new systems can be built. This is not a comfortable lesson. It requires acknowledging how fragile our arrangements are, how quickly everything can come apart. But it is also a hopeful lesson, because it suggests that even in the face of catastrophe, there is possibility for recovery and transformation. Second, these events show us something about the interconnectedness of human societies and human problems. The Great Famine was caused by climate change, shifts in global weather patterns that were completely beyond human control or comprehension at the time. The Black Death was caused by the movement of trade goods and people along international routes, by the connection of distant parts of the world through commerce and communication. These were not local problems but global catastrophes, affecting millions of people across vast distances, and they were connected to each other. The population reduction caused by famine may have actually facilitated the spread of plague by creating ideal conditions for the transmission and spread of disease. We live in a world that is, if anything, even more interconnected than the medieval world. Understanding how medieval people dealt with global catastrophes, how they adapted, how they failed, how they eventually recovered, may offer us insights that are relevant to our own time. Third, these events show us something about the relationship between catastrophe and historical change. The Great Famine and the Black Death did not cause the end of feudalism, but they accelerated processes that were already underway, and they fundamentally disrupted the social structures that held the feudal system together. By studying how catastrophe and social change interacted in this historical period, we can better understand the dynamics of historical transformation more generally. Change is often precipitated by crisis. Crisis can destroy old certainties and create space for new possibilities. Understanding this dynamic may help us think more clearly about periods of change in our own world. And finally, these events matter because they tell us about the human experience across time. The people who lived through the Great Famine and the Black Death were not fundamentally different from us. They experienced hunger, grief, fear, loss, the same basic human emotions that we experience. They struggled to find meaning in catastrophe, to maintain their dignity and their humanity in the face of overwhelming hardship. They grieved their dead and tried to rebuild their lives. They were, in short, people much like us, confronting circumstances that we can imagine, even if we hope we never have to directly experience them. By understanding their experience, we deepen our understanding of what it means to be human, of the range of human experience, of the depths of human resilience, and the heights of human suffering. So as you rest there in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, I hope you carry with you not just a story about historical events, but a sense of the profound human experiences that lie behind those events. The winter of death that froze medieval Europe was real and devastating, but the people who lived through it were also real, with hopes and fears and loves and griefs. They survived, they endured, they eventually rebuilt. And in that survival and rebuilding lies a kind of testament to human resilience that spans the centuries and reaches across time to touch us even now. Let me tell you now about something that happens in the spaces between the great historical events, in the quiet moments when people are simply living their lives in the shadow of catastrophe. This is the territory of recovery that we do not often think about when we study history, but it is perhaps the most important territory of all. Imagine a village. Let us call it Ashford, a name that could belong to many English villages of the period. Before 1315, Ashford was a small but flourishing village. It had perhaps 200 people, a church, a manor house, a mill, scattered cottages arranged along the roads. The lord of the manor was a reasonably prosperous knight, neither particularly wealthy nor particularly poor, who held his lands from a greater noble and owed military service and financial obligations in return. The peasants of Ashford worked their strips of land in the open fields, performed their labor services to the lord, and maintained a careful balance between survival and sufficiency. Then came 1315 and the rains and the hunger. Ashford, like every other village, was transformed. The harvests failed. Hunger set in. By 1316, the village had lost perhaps 30% of its population. The old, the very young, those already weakened by illness or malnutrition, these were the ones most likely to die. By 1320, after several years of poor harvests, perhaps 50% of the original population was gone. But Ashford did not disappear. The survivors organized themselves to continue. Some fields were abandoned, their soil temporarily given over to recovery. Other fields were worked more intensively by the survivors. The mill continued to grind what grain there was. The church still held services, though now there were fewer voices in the congregation. The manor house was still the residence of the Lord, though perhaps the Lord himself was sometimes absent, dealing with his own financial difficulties. In the 1330s, as the agricultural situation improved and the immediate crisis of famine faded into memory, Ashford began to recover. Children were being born again in meaningful numbers. Trade, which had been disrupted, was reviving. Young people were marrying and establishing households. The village began to grow again, though it would never return to exactly what it had been. But something had changed. The trauma of famine had marked the survivors. They organized themselves differently. Some held memories of the old arrangements and the obligations they had entailed, and they were determined not to return to those arrangements if they could help it. When the Lord demanded the old levels of labor service, the surviving peasants sometimes resisted. They pointed out that their population was reduced, that their fields had not yet fully recovered, that the old obligations were not sustainable under the new circumstances. Some of this resistance was successful. In some cases, the old feudal obligations were modified or reduced. In other cases, the Lord held firm and attempted to enforce the old arrangements, leading to tension and sometimes to peasants simply abandoning the village to seek better conditions elsewhere. And then, in the late 1340s, plague arrived. Ashford, being a small village somewhat removed from major trading centers, may have escaped the very worst of the initial plague outbreak. But plague would have come eventually. Perhaps a merchant passed through, or a pilgrim, or a traveler, and with them came the disease. The plague would have struck Ashford with terrible force, killing perhaps 40 to 60% of the remaining population. The recovery from plague in a village like Ashford would have been different from recovery in a city, but in many ways equally challenging. Fewer hands meant that some fields could not be worked. Some crafts, the blacksmith, the miller, the carpenter, might have lost their practitioners to plague, and rebuilding those skills required time and luck. Yet plague also created opportunities. Surviving craftspeople found their services in high demand. Surviving landholders might find themselves able to acquire additional land at favorable terms from lords desperate to maintain their income. Over the decades following plague, Ashford would have changed and evolved. By 1400, 100 years after the initial plague outbreak, the village would be different in many ways from what it had been in 1315. The feudal obligations might have been reduced or modified. Some peasants might own more land than before. The relationships between lords and peasants might be more negotiated, less absolute. The village might have acquired a market charter, allowing weekly markets to be held, bringing in additional income and trade. And the people of Ashford would carry in their bones and their memories the marks of what they had endured. Stories would be told. Perhaps an old woman would tell her grandchildren about the Great Famine, about how people had eaten tree bark, about the children who had not survived. Perhaps another would tell about the plague, about the terrible swiftness of death, about the bodies piled for burial. These stories would become part of the collective memory of the village, would shape how people thought about risk and survival and the fragility of life. This kind of village recovery happened countless times across medieval Europe. It is the story that does not get written down in chronicles, that does not appear in the major historical records, but it is the story that, in many ways, defines what medieval recovery from catastrophe actually looked like. It is not one dramatic moment of transformation, but rather a slow, patient process of rebuilding, of adaptation, of learning to live with loss and yet continuing forward. Now, I want to help you understand something else, something that we can only see if we step back and look at the entire period from 1315 to 1400 as a unified whole. This period, which encompasses both the Great Famine and the Black Death, and the recovery from both, represents a kind of hinge moment in European history. The world that existed before 1315 was, in many ways, the high medieval world, feudal in its organization, hierarchical in its structure, confident in its certainties, though of course there were always tensions and uncertainties. The world that emerged by 1400 was different, still medieval in many ways, still feudal in formal structure, but subtly and profoundly changed. The catastrophes of 1315 and the decades following had introduced a new kind of awareness into European consciousness. People had lived through the end of the world, or something that felt very much like the end of the world. They had discovered that the systems they had built could fail, that death could come suddenly and universally, that no amount of social status or piety or wealth could guarantee survival. This knowledge, once gained, could not be unlearned. It sank into the European psyche and shaped how people thought about their societies, their institutions, their relationships with God and with each other. The hierarchies of medieval society became, if not more questioned, at least more fragile. The authority of the church, while still immense, had been slightly damaged by its failure to prevent or adequately explain catastrophe. The authority of kings and nobles had been questioned by peasant rebellions and by the necessity of negotiating with a reduced but increasingly valuable peasant labor force. The certainties of medieval Christianity, while not abandoned, had been complicated by the experience of suffering on a scale that seemed difficult to reconcile with the existence of an all-powerful, all-benevolent God. Into this space of questioning and uncertainty, new ideas began to flow. The recovery of classical texts, the emphasis on individual reason and experience rather than unquestioned authority, the willingness to challenge established hierarchies, these developments that we associate with the Renaissance and the early modern world, began their slow emergence. They did not emerge suddenly in the 15th century. They had roots that extended back through the 14th century, into the immediate aftermath of plague, into the years of recovery and questioning that followed catastrophe. There is also something to be said about how the catastrophes shaped European attitudes toward nature and the environment. Before 1315, the medieval worldview had encompassed a certain kind of confidence that the world operated according to divine law, that God had created the world for human use, that there was a natural order that would be maintained. The Great Famine and the Black Death revealed the inadequacy of this worldview. Nature, it seemed, was not under humanity's control. God, if benevolent, was at least inscrutable in his ways. The world was more complex, more chaotic, more threatening than medieval people had imagined. This realization eventually contributed to the development of the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries. If you want to survive in a world that is chaotic and threatening, you need to understand how it actually works. You need to observe, to test, to develop theories that can be verified through experience. You need, in short, to develop science. The catastrophes of the 14th century did not cause the scientific revolution, but they helped to create the intellectual conditions in which scientific thinking could emerge and eventually flourish. There is also something to be considered about the artistic and literary responses to catastrophe. The 14th and 15th centuries saw a flowering of art and literature that dealt explicitly with themes of death, suffering, loss, and the transience of human life. The dance macabre appears in art and in literature. The memento mori tradition, remember that you will die, becomes more prominent. Literature becomes more psychologically introspective, more concerned with the inner lives of characters. These developments can be understood in part as the artistic and cultural response to the trauma of plague and famine. But there is also something else happening in the art and literature of this period. There is a new appreciation for beauty, for sensory experience, for the pleasures of life. The Decameron, which we mentioned earlier, celebrates the beauty of the countryside and the pleasures of good company and good conversation. The visual art of the period, while dealing with religious subjects and with death, also shows an increasingly sophisticated interest in depicting human beauty, in representing the natural world with greater accuracy and appreciation. There is a kind of defiant celebration of life happening alongside the meditation on death. This dual response, simultaneous acknowledgement of death and celebration of life, may be one of the most important cultural legacies of the post-plague period. It is also worth noting that the catastrophes of 1315 and the decades following had significant effects on the development of medicine and hygiene, though these effects were often indirect and took centuries to fully play out. During plague, people developed theories about contagion and about the transmission of disease. These theories were often incorrect by modern standards, but they were steps in the direction of understanding disease transmission. The idea that plague might be spread through physical contact, that isolation of the sick might help prevent spread, these ideas, which seem obvious to us now, were revolutionary at the time. They represented a move away from purely spiritual or astrological explanations of disease toward more mechanistic, natural explanations. Similarly, the catastrophes prompted discussions about public health and the role of authorities in maintaining the health and safety of communities. When plague struck cities, they had to grapple with questions about quarantine, about isolation of the sick, and about the proper response to epidemic disease. These discussions and the policies that emerged from them were often ad hoc and imperfect, but they represented the beginning of public health as a concern of the government, the first steps toward thinking about disease and health as community problems rather than purely individual ones. Now, dear friends, as you lie there in the darkness, allowing yourself to sink deeper and deeper into the comfort of your bed, I want to help you understand one more crucial aspect of this story. We have been talking about history, about events and trends and long-term changes. But history is ultimately not about abstractions. It is about human beings, about the ways that historical events shape individual lives and consciousness. Think about a person who was born in 1310, who was thus 5 years old when the Great Famine began. This person would have memories, perhaps not fully clear or conscious memories, but memories nonetheless, of hunger and hardship and loss. These memories would have formed them, shaped how they understood the world. They would have grown up during the famine years, forming their personality and their worldview in the context of scarcity and uncertainty. By the time they reached adulthood, perhaps in the 1330s, the famine was over, but the mark it had left on them would remain forever. They would always remember that food could run out, that security could vanish, that the world was not reliably safe. Then, if this person lived long enough, and some did, reaching their 60s or 70s, they would also have lived through at least some of the plague years. They would have seen people die with terrible swiftness. They would have known that death could come at any moment, that no amount of preparation or caution could guarantee survival. The combination of having lived through the Great Famine and then having lived through plague would have profoundly shaped their consciousness and their understanding of the world. And these people, carrying these memories and these shaped consciousnesses, would have raised children and grandchildren. They would have told stories. They would have instilled in their descendants a certain kind of caution, a certain kind of awareness of the fragility of life. The trauma of the 14th century would have been passed down, transformed and diluted through the generations, but still present. This is how historical catastrophe works at the level of individual consciousness and family memory. It creates a kind of collective wound that shapes how people think and feel for generations. People who lived through the Great Famine and the Black Death were marked by these experiences in ways that their descendants would inherit, not genetically but culturally and psychologically. And this, in turn, shaped the history that followed. The people of the late 14th and 15th centuries were people who carried, in their cultural memory, the knowledge that catastrophe could strike, that the world could fall apart, that survival was uncertain. This knowledge made them, in some ways, both more pessimistic and more pragmatic than their predecessors. It also made them, perhaps, more willing to question authority and to seek new ways of understanding and organizing their world. It made them hungry, in a sense, for new knowledge and new ways of making meaning. So when the Renaissance came, when the new learning and the new ways of thinking began to emerge, they fell on soil that had been prepared by catastrophe. The people of the 15th and 16th centuries were primed, in a sense, to receive new ideas, to question old certainties, to explore new possibilities. The intellectual and cultural flowering of the Renaissance and early modernity was not simply a matter of discovering old texts and recovering old ideas. It was the flowering of a culture that had been transformed by catastrophe and was seeking new ways to understand and live in a world that had revealed itself to be far more complex and dangerous than medieval people had imagined. Let us return now, for a moment, to the question that sits at the heart of this story. What was the winter of death? It was, in the most immediate sense, the Great Famine of 1315-1322 and the Black Death that followed in 1347 and the years thereafter. But it was more than just those events. It was the winter that froze not just the climate and the crops, but the certainties of medieval civilization. It was the winter that revealed the fragility of human systems, the randomness of death, the inadequacy of medieval explanations and medieval responses to catastrophe. And it was also, paradoxically, the winter that gave birth to something new. The old medieval world, with all its hierarchies and certainties and deeply embedded structures, was damaged by these catastrophes in ways that could not be fully healed. In its place, gradually, over centuries, a new world emerged. It was not a perfect world, and it brought new problems and new forms of suffering, but it was shaped profoundly by the experience of catastrophe and recovery. This is the deeper meaning of the winter of death, that it was not merely destructive, though it was certainly that. It was also transformative. It showed that even the most terrible catastrophes can be survived, that even the most profound disruptions can eventually lead to recovery and renewal, that humanity has the capacity to endure and to build anew, even in the face of overwhelming horror. And now, dear friends, as we come to the end of our long journey through time, I invite you to simply rest. Let yourself sink deeper into the softness of your bed. Feel the weight of the blankets around you, the warmth gathering, the sense of safety and enclosure. Your breathing has slowed, become deeper and more regular. Your body has grown heavier, more relaxed. The story has brought you to this place of peace and rest, and now we can allow the narrative to settle into stillness. The winter of death froze medieval Europe not with a single terrible winter, but with years of catastrophe and hardship that tested every limit of human endurance. People starved in the Great Famine. People died with terrible swiftness in the Black Death. Families were shattered. Communities were nearly destroyed. The world, for a time, seemed to be ending. And yet it did not end. Life continued. People survived. They grieved their losses, but they also found ways to rebuild and to move forward. In the midst of suffering, they discovered resilience. In the face of uncertainty, they eventually created new certainties. In the wreckage of the old world, they began to build something new. This story that I have told you is, in one sense, a story about the past. It is about things that happened more than 600 years ago to people who lived in a world very different from our own. They did not have electricity or modern medicine or the comforts we take for granted. They faced dangers and hardships that we, living in the modern world, can barely imagine. But in another sense, this story is not about the past at all. It is about the eternal human capacity to endure. It is about the way that catastrophe can shake the foundations of civilization, and yet civilization persists. It is about the way that grief and loss can transform a person, and yet life goes on. It is about the resilience that is built into the very fabric of human existence. As you drift now into sleep, I hope you carry with you not a sense of fear or despair about the catastrophes we have discussed. Yes, terrible things happened. Yes, millions died. Yes, suffering was immense and widespread, but all of that is in the past. Those people who suffered through the Great Famine and the Black Death endured. They survived. They rebuilt. They created art and literature and new ways of thinking. They passed on to their descendants a world that, while still difficult and challenging, was also full of new possibilities and new hope. And we, living here in the present, are the descendants of those survivors. Their resilience flows through our veins. Their capacity to endure in the face of catastrophe is part of our inheritance. We are the children of people who lived through the winter of death and found themselves still standing on the other side. So let yourself rest now, knowing that you are the inheritor of a long line of survivors. Let yourself sleep, secure in the knowledge that the human spirit, fragile as it is, has proven again and again its capacity to endure, to adapt, to transform catastrophe into the seeds of something new. The night is peaceful. The darkness is safe. Your bed is warm and comfortable. And as you drift into sleep, you carry with you the profound knowledge that life, human life, with all its suffering and all its joy, all its loss and all its renewal, continues. The winter of death came to medieval Europe, but spring followed. After the famine came recovery. After plague came rebuilding. The people who lived through those terrible years were marked by them, transformed by them, shaped by them in ways that would echo through the centuries. But they survived. And in that survival, in that endurance, in that gradual turning from destruction toward renewal, lies a message that transcends time and speaks to something fundamental in what it means to be human. Rest now, dear friends. Let your thoughts grow quiet. Let the story settle into your memory like sediment in still water, gradually forming layers. The great events we have discussed, the famine, the plague, the recovery, will remain with you, but they will rest gently in your mind, not disturbing your sleep but enriching it, giving it meaning and depth. Tomorrow will bring new days, new challenges, new joys. But tonight, you can rest secure in the knowledge that you come from a long line of people who faced catastrophe and did not break. You come from people who endured. Your ancestors looked into the abyss and they did not look away, but they also did not despair. They found ways to live, to love, to create, to build, to hope. As the night deepens around you, as sleep comes closer and closer, allow yourself to feel connected to those distant ancestors. Feel the continuity between their time and yours. Feel the unbroken chain of human experience that connects you to those who lived through the winter of death. And know that you are strong because they were strong, that you can endure because they endured. The story is complete now. The winter of death has been told. The people of medieval Europe have had their story recounted, their suffering, their courage, their determination to continue despite overwhelming hardship. Their lives mattered. Their experiences shaped the world we live in. And by knowing their story, by taking time to understand what they went through and how they responded, we honor their memory and we deepen our own understanding of what it means to be human. So let sleep come now, gentle and complete. Let your mind grow peaceful. Let your body grow heavy and warm. The story has done its work. The winter of death, that terrible time in human history, has been transformed into a narrative that you can carry with you, not as a burden, but as a gift. The gift of knowing that life endures. The gift of understanding that catastrophe, terrible as it is not the end of the story. Close your eyes now, dear friends. Feel yourself sinking deeper into the comfort of your bed. Your breathing continues, slow and steady and peaceful. The world outside the circle of your warmth continues on, but you are here, safe, secure, at rest. The night holds you gently. Sleep comes like a friend, like a gift, like a return to a place of peace and renewal. The winter of death froze medieval Europe, but it did not freeze the human spirit. People endured, civilizations were remade, the world continued. And that truth, that beautiful, profound truth about the resilience of humanity, is what I leave with you as you drift into the peace of sleep. Good night, dear friends. Sleep well. Dream gently, and know that you are part of a long and unbroken chain of human experience that stretches backward through time to those medieval survivors and forward into a future still unwritten. Rest now. Rest and be at peace.